Greetings, everyone, and welcome to this podcast, which is the first in a three-part series that's going to take a look at some of the challenges facing organizations today as they try to widen their access governance stance. Access management as a discipline continues to evolve, and so must the tools, the practices, and the processes we use to achieve our goals. I'm Chris Williams, a Business Solutions Manager with Aveksa Software. We enable organizations to ensure that only the right people have appropriate access to your most precious commodity, your data, your information. We're going to start off with a look at where we came from as an industry in order to better understand where we're headed. So, let's begin with a quick look at our origins. Automated Security Administration. That's a great term, isn't it? And really, for lack of a better set of definitions, this is our humble origins. We started off in the early 90s, along with the same time that distributed systems began to really blossom across our environments. And we focused on a few simplistic business cases, making sure that when people join our organization that they were productive as quickly as possible. Also making sure that as they moved throughout the organization, that we executed some basic change management capabilities to ensure that they were provisioned with the right levels of access so they could continue to do a fabulous job for our organizations. Now with this, think about it, we've got all of these new points of access coming up, be they mainframe, legacy environments, and all the distributed systems that are popping out. Well, this means that we also had a lot of different means of authentication, different passwords. And those password characteristics changed mightily from a traditional 8-character password over to what could be 8 to 15 to 20 character passwords, uppercase, lowercase, numerics. No matter how you slice it, it was a daunting task for our users to get used to. And a lot of them took some shortcuts, as we all know, like writing down all of their IDs and systems and passwords on a little piece of paper and sticking it underneath their keyboards. Not exactly best practices, but this is what was going on. So we had to manage that aspect of security as well. And of course, when somebody left, we had to make sure that we took away their points of access as well. And all too often we saw in the news around the end of the 90s and the beginning of the 2000s what happens when we don't place the right levels of care against terminating that access. Now, if you think about this, 4 basic things: giving it to them, managing it throughout their life cycles, making sure that our users can get to stuff, and taking it away as appropriate. We had a very finite group of people that were in charge of doing all of this. Quite a daunting task, considering that new systems, new applications, new databases, new resources were basically being put into production on a weekly basis. So we had a workload problem as well, which is why we needed to automate. And of course, when we went to automate something in the mid-90s, we did it through a framework-centric approach. We saw a lot of that for managing systems. We're all familiar with those big frameworks, but also in the identity world and access world, we had our own frameworks coming up, and they were based around this nebulous identity account repository, which is basically a form of keyword association, right? A person with maybe a role or a group definition and all their access points, trying to figure out who was what and where and how many points of access they had. And we spent a lot of time developing custom application interpretations, if you will, within the engine itself to make sure that we're all talking about the same thing and controlling the same stuff. And we also spent quite a bit of time figuring out how to disseminate this information. Because with distributed systems came the use cases that not only was stuff within our data center, within our traditional house, but now they were also reaching out to distributed environments. And if you think about like a retail organization that had 500 or 1,000 different stores, each one of those likely had a server of some sort, had an access point of some sort, maybe had some sort of local repository or local set of applications they had to interface with, so we had to manage all of that. And that's why we took on that, what we understood to be the best at the time, that framework approach. But is that where we spent all of our time? Not so much. We spent the majority of our time building custom interfaces that would talk to resident security systems. And those resident security systems can be thought of as applications, they could be thought of as servers, they could be mid-frames that are logistically dispositioned across a wide environment, it could be databases, and each one of those custom interfaces had to have a large group of capabilities sitting behind it, right? User account mapping, encryption, how are we going to pass stuff from our protected zone to our unprotected zones, what we're going to do as far as additional capabilities beyond the agent's base functionality. Those could be like post and pre-script functions, which could be equated to something such as before I delete an account, I would like to copy and preserve all of that user's data on that device, right? So we could trap it, we could see what they were doing. And of course, we had one overriding practice that really sat across this agent farm management paradigm, and that was deployment. How many different points of coverage could we create and maintain? Most organizations hardly got beyond that 20% ratio. And so a lot of the things that we were doing were never deemed completely effective because we never hit some of those base metrics of enterprise-wide coverage that we had anticipated and that we had reported back to our management in order to get funding. So this strong focus on agents really did eventually lead to our own undoing in this practice. Now, at the same time as we're building these technical frameworks, we are also very much trying to aspire towards aligning with process frameworks. Probably the most widely known IT framework would have been ITIL. Still a formidable set of processes. I'm a big proponent of it. I love ITIL to death. There's a lot of great information in there, but it didn't really span over to the access management world specifically, right? It was more about managing services, how we deploy them, how we maintain them, how we retire them, not the user access lifecycle. There were some other frameworks that came up, like CMMI, which is really great when you think about what you're doing in the application world. But again, it didn't quite look at what we needed for best practices to provision, to monitor, to maintain, to review access rights. So even though these two are extraordinarily effective, didn't quite get to the results that we needed from a management point of view. A great example of this would be if you take a look at, and this is a slice of ITIL v3, if you look at ITIL, itself, there's a lot of stuff there about managing a service, right? An IT-based service. But if you want to get specific to our needs in this industry, access management is just a very small piece of their puzzle. And when you read the ITIL documentation around access management, beyond getting recommendations like, hey, it's good to have some, you didn't quite get what we needed to create lifecycle management, to better understand the nuances of authentication, authorization, approval processes, access administration, audit, compliance, that sort of thing. Right? Didn't span the gamut of what we needed as a set of practitioners with a very specific scope. So what did we do? Well, we looked at it, we said, there's a lot of good stuff in these frameworks, and maybe what we need to do is map what we're doing and how well we're doing it to some sort of maturity model. And I think we're all very much familiar with this kind of scale and interpretive paradigm here, where we go from being a chaotic environment all the way down to some sort of optimized system where we see a lot of automation because our processes are so well defined, our practices are well defined, our verbs are very well understood, and our use cases are interpreted to the point where we can automate a complete life cycle. But once more, we are trying to adopt something not custom made. And when you go down that path, well, you find yourself spending a lot of time reinventing the wheel. And it didn't still meet our needs. So what are we going to do at this point? Well, this is around 2000 or so. We knew that there was a better way of doing what we were doing, but we really needed a strong kick in the pants, if you will, to make governance not an afterthought. And if we look at some of the incidents that occurred prior to the Sarbanes-Oxley doctrine, we see that governance really had to modify not only in the perception point of view of the importance it had, but also as far as a sponsored program within organizations. And with this sponsorship came, well, a new light. So we see things like COBIT that is sporting out very specific control objectives for how we plan and acquire and introduce new services, and some of the dominating activities we had to put in place to make sure that governance was well addressed over the life cycle of the service and the users of those services. We also saw, coming to light from COSO, an element that we hadn't really entertained before, and that was very explicit documentation around risk, around what we were doing to protect our informational assets, right? So now we see a morph in our attitude, if you will, as an IT and business organization that comes together. And even very recently, we see that these are not stagnant activities, that consortiums are still focused on what to do to protect data no matter where it resides. And things like CSA takes that to the next level. So we can better understand how to protect data in our environment, at our distributed systems, and also from service providers, be they software as a service, infrastructure as a service, or platform as a service providers, right? It's still our data, and we still need to protect it as best as we can. So we see an evolution taking place now. I think that evolution is really well understood when we look at something that, for example, just recently was released from COBIT 5. We see a transition from IT-centric activities and terminology into business activities and terminologies, even down to the point where we're looking at the needs of our stakeholders. How are we managing those needs? How are we measuring our effectiveness to meet those needs? What kind of good practices, best practices are we including, and how do we measure their effectiveness? So now we are positioned that we've gone from our origins of just doing security administration on distributed systems and mainframe systems and databases that were all in-house, to what can we best do to meet our business needs regardless of where data resides. Makes you want to stand back and take a look at what we're doing today. Each one of the major best practice oriented doctrines has a lot of good stuff to offer us, right? But we really need to take that introspective step and look holistically at what we're doing for access management as its own unique environment with unique needs, as a unique discipline. And from that, we can extrapolate really what we need to do is take a look at how we address access governance. How do we actually see it? How do we get the entitlements together? How do we classify it, right? How do we put all of this into buckets of understanding that has the right optics placed against it so that we can introduce policies that further help us reach our goals, because they are stringent policies with explicit guidelines, but also because there are policies in place we can automate some practices, be they for mutual exclusivity, like segregations of duties, very specific items of stewardship around compliance controls that address what we do internally for the people who join our organization, who move around in our organization, and eventually leave that. Well, we also know that when we look at this with this set of optics, that we can further expand our capabilities by adopting a life cycle approach, utilizing elements of role and group definitions that conform with our policies, right? And of course, once we have these three elements in place, now from a business point of view and from a business user's activity set, we can make the right requests to govern our access activities, and that those requests will be aligned with our policy change management practices, right? And this is now driven by the business user environment, not by the IT supporters. Now, the last thing we need to do is think about, like in any other kind of framework approach, okay, I've got these great things I want to do. How am I going to get there? Because these are great things independent of each other. But in order to make it holistic, we have to put a fulfillment engine behind it. We have to be able to understand when changes are made, or if there are instances that conflict with our policies, that we have the right level of notifications sent to the right recipients so they can take an action. And on the back end, we want to automate some stuff so that IT is still aware of what's going on. So let's say for each violation of policy, or with each exception, that we open up a service desk incident or a ticket, so we record things accordingly. And of course, on the back end, once the business user is fully indoctrinated into this process and has all of these capabilities behind them, seeing as they're the ones that best know the environment, that they have the ability to execute changes. So we want to be able to fulfill the recommendations by our business monitors, our reviewers, our business supervisors who are guarding our access entitlements, that their requests pass through the system automatically and get fulfilled. That way we get complete life cycle, and we can also get validation of whether or not those requests have actually taken place. Right? So we've moved from just worrying about how we onboard people and how we get rid of them from our access definitions at the end of the day into a living, breathing environment that is focused on access needs, access governance practices, with the ability to take actions as needed, as best recommended by the people who are chartered with protecting our information and our data. So that's our origins. In the next set, we're going to take a look at, in the next podcast, what we're doing with it with immediate trends on the horizon, and also what we need to truly embrace this new pathway. I'm Chris Williams, a Business Solutions Manager with Aveksa Software. For more information, you can contact any one of our offices around the world, or you can go to our website at www.aveksa.com for more information. Thank you so much for listening in on this podcast, and I'll see you on the next in our series of 3. Have a good day.